Hello and welcome to the pharmaphorum podcast. I'm your host, Jonah Comstock. My guest today is Jameka Hill, Senior Director of Clinical Trial Health Equity at Moderna. Jameka recently accepted Moderna's Delivering Inclusive Trials Award at the Reuters Pharma Europe 2022 event for the work they did on diversity, equity, and inclusion in their COVID-19 vaccine trials. I interviewed her for an upcoming deep dive feature on clinical trial diversity, and I really enjoyed the conversation, so I wanted to bring her on the podcast to share some of her insights and perspectives on this important topic with all of you. Welcome to the show, Jameka.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to talk about such an important topic.
So to start, tell me a little bit about the context for this, the award that Moderna got and your approach to DEI during your COVID vaccine trials.
I think, if we think back prior to COVID, Moderna was a younger organization. We're kind of coming out of our infancy, and we really had an opportunity not just to show up, but to show up in a way that was inclusive. And so recognizing that diverse populations are truly underrepresented, we wanted to make a deliberate effort upfront to work with our sites, to work with our communities in a way where we would have adequate representation of people of all backgrounds. But the one thing we didn't know at the time was that, barbershops, community events, things of that nature were obviously still not open. Everyone was kind of on lockdown. And so some of the more traditional ways that we anticipated we'd be able to include people from all backgrounds just wasn't available. And so as our phase 3 COVE study kind of evolved, we were able to see that we weren't actually achieving the diversity that we actually needed and that we were committed to. And so as a result, we made the bold decision to slow our enrollment in order to ensure that there was enough time to enable people of all backgrounds and of diverse communities and populations to participate in our trial. And as a result, we were able to achieve 37% persons of color, which is a huge feat for any organization, let alone one coming out of its infancy. Historically, we've seen around 2 to 6% persons of color participate in clinical trials. And so certainly we're proud of that. And that award was just kind of a recognition of the bold statement that Moderna made by slowing enrollment and kind of challenging the status quo to ensure that we had adequate representation of all people.
Yeah, actually slowing down in that circumstance when, the whole world was racing to get this vaccine out and you're to some extent racing against your competitors, it really is a pretty big statement about the importance of that representation and that diversity. So tell me a little bit about why that's important to you personally and why it's important to Moderna.
Yeah. Okay. This is such a great question. I mean, I'm very passionate about it personally and I think professionally. So personally, for 23 years, I've kind of been focused on marginalized communities and hard to reach communities and populations and ensuring that people are understand and kind of are really empowered with the awareness and education to make some decisions about their healthcare that are different and looking at clinical trials as kind of a healthcare option, if you will. And so having an opportunity at Moderna to really live my values, externally was something that was really, really meaningful to me. I am a Black woman, and Black individuals as well as women have historically been underrepresented despite all the efforts that, regulatory agencies around the globe have made to ensure that there is some equity there. And so it's very personal to me. And then I think, the reality is that we're an aging population. Most people have mothers, sisters, aunties, things of that nature. And so the people who have been marginalized are us. They're our family, they're our friends. And so it's really important to me personally that I'm a part of the change that I think is so necessary in the health system and in health equity. And then at Moderna, I joined an organization that aligns with my values, and their values are very much in that, including underrepresented populations is really a vital step towards achieving health equity. Infectious diseases disproportionately affect certain ages, sexes, ethnicities, and geographies. And so thoughtfully tailoring our clinical trial methodology to these demographics is something that will hopefully pave the way for a change that we see throughout the industry.
And we certainly saw that with COVID. Obviously, we saw that it did not affect all demographics equally. It was particularly hard on a lot of minority populations. And that's one thing I want to ask about. You kind of mentioned, there's a flexibility of the approach that was required, right? As this data came in, as we learned how this disease was affecting these different populations, to make the trial representative, you needed to sort of adjust, as well as just adapting to, as you mentioned, certain modalities not being available, things not working. So tell me about how you foster that kind of flexibility in a field, the clinical trials, which is often known for its sort of like rigidity and adherence to rules.
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic question. I think we rely heavily on selecting sites with inclusion in mind, right? Like, we can't ask sites to enroll minorities and diverse populations if they actually are in a region that there's a diverse community around them. And so I think we first try and set our sites up for success and set ourselves up for success. The other thing that we really try and be purposeful in is typically what happens in clinical trials is it's first come, first serve. And that has historically always worked just fine. Although not everyone hears about clinical trials at the same rate or has the opportunity to, stop what they're doing immediately and go into a clinical trial site for evaluation. And so one of the things we're really working with our sites on is taking a look at who their population is in the surrounding community, and then making a deliberate and upfront effort to reach out to the community before the clinical trial is actually going, because we also want to make sure this is inclusive. And it's not inclusive if you have people who are excited and have signed up and then you have to tell them, oh, sorry, that's not our goal. Our goal is to make sure that our clinical research sites are doing everything they can to build and foster trust in the community and allow those that have raised their hand an opportunity by giving them a little bit of time.
Another thing I've heard as I've researched this topic is that often diversity efforts can focus too exclusively on recruitment, as opposed to sort of the accessibility challenges of making sure you keep those participants in the trial and they're able to participate fully and give you good data. So tell me a little bit about that side of it for you guys.
That's an absolute problem for sure. I think that, historically we always hear that enrollment is the biggest barrier to clinical trial success. But you're absolutely right, Jonah. There's also another barrier, and that's the attrition, right? And making sure that we have individuals who stay all the way through. And sometimes these trials are 2 years, a year and a half, and everyone has really busy lives. And so that's why I think it's really important that we continue as an industry to really focus on some decentralized models and ways that we can actually allow for individuals to continue to live their daily life while participating, because they're not having to travel 2 hours into, a clinic visit, which, to your point, it just creates a huge logistical barrier. And so it's thoughtful trial designs where we really are incorporating all those things we found out during COVID are really meaningful, and they actually do work. I mean, I don't think that many people probably leveraged telehealth until the pandemic. And now I think many people use it as, a very valid way of communicating with their physician.
So I definitely want to get into decentralization and telehealth. Let's put it on the back burner for just a moment, because I want to make sure we really talk about this experience with the vaccine. And so my last question, and answer this how you see fit, because I hate to ask people to talk critically about their competitors any more than they're comfortable. But how did you see Moderna's approach differing from the other companies that were working on this same problem at this very sort of critical time?
So, I want to applaud the industry first and foremost, right? I think that all of our partner pharma organizations really have honed in and wanted to try and make sure that we had adequate representation across all of the COVID vaccine trials. And then moving forward, I would say the upside or advantage that Moderna had that other organizations may not have is that we are nimble and we are able to pivot in the face of new data, in the face of new realities as far as what's happening. And oftentimes when you get larger organizations that have been around for 20, 30, 50 years, or longer, it's much more difficult for them to pivot or to change kind of the way that they're conducting clinical trials. At Moderna, we've really woven into the very fabric of our operating model how we make sure that diverse representation and minority representation across the spectrum is included not just on our COVID trial, but now on every one of our trials across the entire um, drug delivery system. So whether it's a phase 1, whether it's a phase 3, whether it's an infectious disease trial, whether it's an oncology trial, making sure that we're very thoughtful and upfront and that it's woven into the way we actually conduct trials gives us, I think, an advantage that oftentimes bigger organizations that have been here longer maybe don't have.
That does make me think about measurability and accountability. I know there's a lot more talk than there used to be about diversity and equity, both in health in general, but especially in clinical trials. And I mean, it's heartening to see how much of a priority it is in companies' rhetoric. But I would love to start being able to see in the data, what percentage of trials actually are representative of their populations, and so it sounds like you guys are doing some of that work on your end to track. Um, and so I'd love to hear a little bit about that. How do you approach
Yeah.
measurement and accountability?
Yeah, so I mean, we don't want to just be a talking head, candidly, right? We want to be able to also hold ourselves accountable. And the only way we can hold ourselves accountable is to ensure that we have the digital tools to share where we started and where we currently are and where we want to get to. And so Moderna has really invested a lot early on into our technology and our infrastructure. And we also really believe wholeheartedly that we need to be transparent about kind of where we are and share our ambitions and expectations with the sites in a way that allows transparency. So across the board, you can't know if you're ahead or behind in a game if no one's keeping score. And so we share digital dashboards with our sites in an effort to be very transparent around not only what we expect from them, but overall how well the study is doing. I think there's this notion that sites will only do the bare minimum, and we found just the opposite. When sites understand that we're behind based on the scientific imperative of enrolling the intended population, they are more than happy to kind of lift and see how they can help solve for the problem. And so we really rely heavily on those digital tools in order to track. And as a result, in the past 2 years, we've been able to enroll 63,000 persons of color across 17 of our clinical trials from phase 1 to phase 3. And those 63,000 individuals in our clinical trials, it comprises over 37% persons of color across the board. So we had some trials that were really high. In fact, we had a few trials that were encroaching on 60% persons of color. And we had to go similar to COVE and say, oh, actually, we need to pull back because we need adequate representation, which means that we also need white participants. White participants are critically important. And our effort, again, is to be inclusive. And so we had to balance that scale in the same way that we did with COVID. But the transparency and the digital tools really allow for everyone to know, what page we're on and really moves, lockstep with one another.
Yeah, I was just Googling. I was curious sort of at the U.S. population what those percentages look like. And it looks like it's pretty close, about 60% white. Obviously, it changes all the time and there's a bunch of ways to count it. But
Yeah. I think the biggest thing is, when it comes to infectious diseases, even though the general population is 60% white, certainly those that are most impacted by infectious diseases, which is one of the main areas Moderna focuses on, is certainly much higher than that. We don't ever want to get to a place where we're enrolling, all of any specific subdemographic, right? We want to always be sure that there's balance because our goal is optimally to make sure that the vaccines and medicines that we bring forward are safe and effective for all people.
I want to mention one more thing you alluded to earlier before we get into the decentralization conversation, which is you kind of mentioned that clinical trial equity and health equity are not two separate things because clinical trials are increasingly care and they're a form of care that isn't available in any other way. So if you don't have access to clinical trial, you don't have access to top of the line care, basically. And that seems like an obvious point, but it to me feels like one that's worth making explicitly because in the conversation about clinical trial diversity, I think a lot of people are thinking about the science and they're
Mhm.
thinking about the representation in the data, but there's this very real impact for the participants themselves. So I would love to just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So There's a huge disparity when it comes to people who even hear and access clinical trials, but a lot of that has. I mean, it's a mind shift, honestly, Jonah. Right? Like when you think about clinical trials historically, people are like, "Oh, I don't want to participate in that." It's research, it's an experiment, not understanding that. Well, yes, there's some elements that are variable and that we're actually testing for. But in addition to that, you're going to get very close follow up. And these are the very promising drugs that will then be in the pharmacy tomorrow. Um, and so I think when you start to kind of change the mindset of like, well, participating in a clinical trial actually enables me to be the one first accessing the best potential of a medicine and of our healthcare system. And in addition to that, I'm going to be able to be seen and monitored by the most well-renowned physicians out there, the key opinion leaders, in the specific space. I think that adds an assurance and a safety that people need, but oftentimes, to your point, is not talked about.
And it's hard to talk about, when you start to get into this idea of trust. It's hard to talk about it without acknowledging that the mistrust is not unfounded, right? That we're
No.
still emerging from, the specter of things like the Tuskegee experiment, where marginalized groups were really mistreated in the name of research. So there, trust has to be built up and earned at this point.
Yeah, it has to be. And we still have a long way to go there. I mean, candidly, a long, long way. Not only are we dealing with, past racial, atrocities at the hand of research, but we're also dealing with an age of social media, right? Where there is disinformation that only adds to speculation and distrust out there. But then in addition to that, we have a lack of physicians of color that conduct research. And it doesn't matter how valid the information is. If the person you're receiving the information from, you don't actually trust, it's not of value. And so I think we really, as an industry, need to do a much better job of ensuring that we have an investigative pool that includes an enormously, a much bigger amount of physicians of color. Um, it's very difficult when you think that, there's been lots of data out there that suggests that persons of color and people of color really prefer to be seen by someone who looks like them. Um, and if someone who looks like them is not actually the one saying, I think this would be a great idea for you to participate. Let me explain, the potential risks and the potential benefits, and trust I'm going to be here every step of the way as we kind of move through this. I think it's understandable to think why people would still have a lot of distrust and mistrust. And candidly, they're scared, right? Their safety is at risk.
Yeah. But of course, the irony there is that it might be their best chance. They might be more safe in a
Yeah,
trial than not.
that's exactly right.
So let's talk about the tech piece. At first, I was sort of operating on the assumption that these were two different trends that were hitting clinical trials at the same time. And I think I said as much to you in our last interview. The more interviews I do, the more they seem to be so intertwined that you almost can't make a distinction between clinical trial diversity and decentralization and virtualization, which is interesting because the virtualization story starts much earlier. I should say that they didn't start as being together, but the fact that they both became so important during COVID has really it's sort of one story. So help parse that out for me. How do you think about decentralization as a part of your charge to focus on clinical trial equity?
I think it's like a mom and a dad, or like two parents, actually, I should say, where it's optimal to have them both at the same time working towards the same goal. Um, because the reality is that when you look at a lot of the decentralized methodologies and tools available, it actually helps increase access and extend access um, into communities, neighborhoods, and regions that otherwise just wouldn't have access to participate. And oftentimes those regions and those communities and neighborhoods also include individuals of color, women, lower socioeconomic, or very rural places. And so I think it's really they're working in tandem. And I think that as an industry, we've really started to see that there's value in partnering kind of our efforts with some of the decentralized models in order to ensure that we have diverse representation. I think of older adults oftentimes, how we thought about technology with older adults prior to the pandemic. And there was a lot of skepticism around, well, telehealth might not work. A lot of older adults might not be as technologically savvy as some of the younger generations. And so this isn't a viable tool, and they feel more comfortable actually going in. And during COVID, we just found that that's not the case. And we continue to find that that's not the case, that allowing for additional ways in order to reach and kind of have dialogue with your physician is actually embraced, not just by the younger generation, but also by older adults.
I mean, when you talk about access, we're talking about so many different things, but one of them is like, you know, not just like do you have a car to drive to the site, or does it you have to take the bus and it takes a long time, but also like can you get away from your job to go these things, like all of that stuff that decentralization doesn't solve, but it it certainly sort of like reduces some of the barriers, right?
I mean, I haven't gotten my eyes checked in, I don't know, 4 years since I had my kids. And I was in Moderna and I saw a mobile van that had an ophthalmology clinic. And I went in during my lunch and I got my eyes checked. And I was like, this is exactly what Moderna is doing with clinical research, right? We're trying to work with partners who also have mobile vans. And I think the industry as a whole, right, is trying to see how can we bring the opportunity to to people as opposed to thinking people even have the time to do it, right? Like even if you have the resources, do you have the time to actually go out and put yourself as a priority um, in a situation where it's not dire, right? I think obviously when we think about rare diseases and sometimes oncology, well, a lot of times oncology, um, clinical trials are front and center because they might be the most viable option. But when you think about infectious diseases or you think about chronic ambulatory, high blood pressure, cholesterol, things like that, oftentimes people don't put themselves first because it would take effort, and that effort requires that they then take time away from somebody else that they're serving or that they love. And so I think the decentralized model allows for people also to prioritize their own health without sacrificing the needs of those they care about.
As we start to think about trials as care, the other question that I think that brings up is the data being shared the way it needs to be shared, right? And someone I spoke to recently for my story who mentioned she was actually in a COVID trial, and the researchers wouldn't tell her the results of her COVID tests. So
Yeah.
she had to do a COVID test for Pfizer, and then she had to go drive through CVS to do one so she could see if she had COVID for herself. So there's this real siloing of data when it comes to trials, especially for pharma companies. It comes from a reasonable place of data propriety and things like that. But how do you think about that, and how do you see that kind of shaping up in the future as we move in this direction of thinking about trials as part of care?
I think it's it's critical. I mean, data return is something that as a whole we are all struggling with. I don't know that any one company kind of has a solution for it, but I know it's something that we're all striving to figure out ways where we can deliver the return data, your personal data to you, so that you're also aware of what's happening in your own body, right? Like that's critically important. We just have to balance that with also not unblinding the trial and things of that nature that are critical to achieving the endpoints and making sure that our trials are fair, and just in that way. And so I don't have the answer, Jonah, but I know that it's something that is critically important. And I hope as an industry we continue to get better at. I mean, transparency is important at all levels. And certainly if you're, going to take a step forward and say, yes, I'd like to participate in research, I think that we have a duty to make sure that we're actually providing that data back to the participants in a way that maybe doesn't unblind the data, but certainly provides them with the health information that is theirs and that they deserve.
And that kind of takes us into what I see as the third trend impacting clinical trials, right? There's this increased focus on diversity. There's these new technologies for conducting trials, decentralized, virtualized, not the same thing, but very related. And then there's this notion that maybe we can get past the placebo, right? That like there doesn't have to be a group of people that isn't getting care in order to do a good trial, because we have so much data about what people are like when they're not sick, and we can use it to make models, and then we can use AI. And it's exciting stuff, and it makes me think, like, all in all, like, clinical trials are just going to change so much. We're not going to recognize them in 5 years. What do you think about all that?
No, I totally agree. I've been in here in the industry for 23 years and I still am like, it seems like things have moved slowly when it comes to health equity, but then we get these little boluses where it seems like we do huge paradigm shifts. And I think that absolutely is an area that in the next 5 years, we just won't recognize it. I mean, the notion that you can use real world data instead of having people take a placebo and not having any potential benefit, I think is a huge game changer. I also think it will go a long way to help build trust. Because the reality is that everyone enters a clinical trial hoping and thinking that they're going to be on the positive end and of what they receive, right? And that they're actually going to get the trial or study drug. That it's always a disappointment when the individual does receive the placebo. And so I think if we can leverage real world data in a way that also doesn't include bias, I think we'll be able to make huge headways in the clinical research space.
That was reminds me of an interesting thing I heard at JP Morgan about the FDA, and they did a pre-approval on something, and they said, okay, this is so promising. We want people to be able to get it. So we're going to let you put it in the market, but you have to conduct your phase 3 after the fact. And the problem is, who's going to sign up for that trial? When you could have a 100% chance of getting the drug, why would you take a 50% chance of getting the drug?
Yeah, I mean, we still have that challenge a little bit, candidly, with COVID, right? I mean, COVID is still very, very real, and there's variants and things of that nature that we're still researching. And I think there's always going to be individuals who are interested in giving back in the name of science. And so I think, still honoring those individuals is going to be a huge part of clinical research. But I think also a way that we can extend research opportunities to more people is by doing exactly that, right? If the data is promising enough where it can be entered and approved to allow people to benefit from it. Not all trials will run at the speed of COVID trials and get approval in the time COVID trials did. And so I think that, that can be a win so long as we also kind of measure against real world data and make sure that we're still monitoring for adverse events and things of that sort. Because the goal really of clinical trials is to make sure it's safe and effective before it gets to the wider population. And if we're going to be using the wider population to assess whether or not it's safe and effective, we just want to balance that and make sure that we're ethical towards people.
Yeah, it's tricky. There are not easy answers, right?
Yeah, they sure are not.
So we have really covered a lot, and this has been a fascinating conversation. And clinical trials are rapidly becoming one of my favorite topics in pharma. There's just so much there. But what haven't we talked about? What's on your mind, or what would you love to kind of share with some of your peers or folks in pharma who are maybe not on the R&D side about the work that you do?
That's such a great question. I think, when it comes to trust really is when rubber meets the road. And we can do a whole lot as far as clinical research to make sure that we have equity and that we have diverse representations across the spectrum. But if then when a product is available, it doesn't get to the intended population, we're still back at square one, right? Like all of the efforts that we've invested in trying to make sure that we have adequate data, we still have that, but it's not now going to the population that needs it most. And so I think really it's incumbent on all of us in the industry to really work with community leaders and community organizations in order to make sure that we have a steady drumbeat of a presence in the community, because the reality is that clinical trials can be transactional. You're here today and you're gone in 6 months or gone in a year once enrollment and retention is over. And so how do we make sure that the notion that we actually care about the communities we're trying to serve remains? And I think that overall as an industry, we have to get way better at really partnering with community organizations and community leaders. And then once we have a product, really focusing to make sure that that product gets to those intended people who we've just done a huge effort to make sure are included in our research.
Well, thank you so much, Jameka. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you about this, and I hope we can have you on again sometime.
It would be my pleasure. Thanks so much, Jonah.
That concludes this episode of the pharmaphorum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about other installments in the series at pharmaphorum.com/podcast. The pharmaphorum podcast is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Acast, Stitcher, and Podme, where you can find and subscribe by searching for pharmaphorum. And don't forget to visit our website where you can sign up for daily news and analysis bulletins and to follow us on Twitter at pharmaphorum. Thanks for listening.